Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. Tonight is a general discussion of clinical trials. So Dr. Bonder will not be able to answer any questions specific to any one company's clinical trial. He also will not be able to answer any of your personal medical questions. Now I'd like to introduce you to our moderator for this evening. This is Tom Drain, who joined the PBCers Executive Committee in 2021. He's been a healthcare and pharmaceutical consultant for over 20 years, focusing on strategy, marketing, and communications for patients, caregivers, and gastroenterologists, hepatologists, and other healthcare professionals. Some of you may remember him as our moderator from our 2018 PBC conference, and others that are really longtime PBC patients will remember him from his days at Axcan Farm when he was the patient connection to the PBCers organization. Tom's been with us for a long time in the PBCers organization and has been a great friend to us. He will moderate the discussion tonight and handle the questions with Dr. Bonder. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Alan Bonder. He comes to us from Boston. He originally worked in PBC with a PBC icon, Marshall Cap. Currently, he's assistant professor of medicine, medical director of liver transplant, division of gastroenterology and hepatology at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, Harvard Medical School in Boston. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us tonight, Dr. Bonder. So I'll kick it over to Tom to run the show.
Thank you, Carol. Appreciate that. Hello, everybody. Welcome. As Carol mentioned, welcome you to the clinical trials discussion in rare disease and the importance of clinical trials with Dr. Bonder. As we mentioned, we won't be covering any specific questions related to patient cases, but do encourage everyone to use the chat function down at the bottom of the Zoom to enter any questions that you'd want to add. So to get us started off, just wanted to touch on the key topic, Alan. As far as the importance of clinical trials in rare diseases such as PBC, what's your sentiment or what's your feelings about the importance in making sure that these happen?
So, before we start, Tom, so I just wanted to thank Carol. And again, thanks for the introduction. And, it's a pleasure to be here and contribute with all of you to try to help get more information about this disease. So I think, Tom, let's just start saying that we've come along with PBC. I think for all of you who suffer from PBC, before 2016, we really have not a lot of choices. Actually, we had only one choice. You had ursodiol and basically nothing else approved by the FDA to actually treat this rare disease. Fortunately, after 2016, we had obeticholic acid, and right now we have a lot of new medications coming in the pipeline to treat patients who did not respond to ursodiol. So let me start by saying that, remember, up to 70% of the people respond to ursodiol and 30% don't. So what can we do for all these patients? So right now we have, again, as I just told you, we have the second-line therapy approved by the FDA, which is obeticholic acid. Patients like the second-line therapy because it's approved by the FDA. What it means is already went through a clinical trial, already went through the FDA and got approved and is used conventionally for patients who did not respond to conventional therapy. But not everyone responds to obeticholic acid and not everyone likes taking obeticholic acid because of their side effects. So patients like to have other options. So what other options? Unfortunately, every other option now is in a clinical trial. And this is why it's so important. So the clinical trial aspect basically gives a new armamentarium to actually use on this patient. So what does this mean? So what it means is patients will have different options, different medications to be enrolled in a clinical trial. What is the kind of the process? Well, the process that we gain more information with those patients joining in a clinical trial. But some patients say, I really don't want to be part of it because I could be part of enroll in one of those placebo arms and I won't be able to get the medication. So let's just go a bit back in the history, Tom, about what's a clinical trial. So as I said, the FDA regulates how to basically get medications approved for a certain disease. And usually the time frame, if you look back, it could go between 5 to 10 years, sometimes a little bit longer. So we need all those patients to be enrolled. So we have all the data. We can basically prove the FDA that these medications work. And it starts with a phase 1. A phase 1 is looked at animal studies, it looked at the proof of concept. Phase 2, we start looking at different doses, certain timeframes. We randomize against placebo. And finally, the phase 3 trial comes in. We have a drug, we have a dose, we randomize people to either 1 or 2 arms with different 2 doses, and then we against a placebo, and then if they respond, we basically go in, we do an open label trial, and we go to the FDA. So this is the only way we will get medications approved, and we will get medications kind of like seen for all those different conditions. And actually, we go back and we looked at all the new medications that are really in the pipeline. I can tell you it's very exciting. We have close to 7 to 10 new different medications with different mechanisms that will help and they will improve patients with PBC.
Great. And as far as that aspect of it, thank you for walking through a little bit about the phases, kind of understanding phase 1 up to phase 2 and then into phase 3. And so as you look at all these new mechanisms of action, how do you even, as you consider what trials to work on and enroll your patients in, how much scrutiny do you do in those MOAs, the mechanism of action or the way the drug works in your body? How much research, how do you determine which one's the one you want to enroll patients in versus not?
So that's a really important question. And again, this is just based on what the patient was taking before. For example, a patient who actually was using ursodiol and then was taking obeticholic acid. As we know, there's 2 different receptors in the PBC world that we care about. It's the FXR and the PPAR receptors. And the PPAR receptors have different subtype of receptors. So for example, in a patient who was exposed or was taking obeticholic acid and it doesn't respond to an FXR, there is no point of us in really enrolling those patients in a new FXR, kind of to my point of view, to enroll them in a new FXR, because basically we've known, in theory, that patient failed that receptor agonist medication. So basically I tell them, there's other PPAR, for example, the fibrates or seladelpar, or other medications that we have available that we can use because they're different mechanisms. Okay. Or for example, patient who really don't want to take obeticholic acid because of the side effects are listed, and they want to, they take, for example, fibrates, specifically fenofibrate in the US, this is the only fibrate that we have available. It's specifically to one specific receptor, the PPAR. So we might be either enroll them in a different PPAR receptor agonist or think about switching them to an FXR. So it is important to know what mechanisms are the patient starting with so we can try to change them. And actually, there is now a new trial. We actually combine both. How about if we fail one? How about if we use both? So again, I think you bring a really important point in research is we need to know what are the patients exposed to, what are receptors we're used to, and then we will have new options for them.
Great. And I wonder, one of the things I know in like oncology and kind of treating that condition as a very separate condition, but for many people kind of a lifelong as well. How is that aspect of not only what has failed with someone like an FXR and that may not work or whatever, but also looking at kind of staging as far as going from one condition to, or one type of mechanism and then trying a different one and then trying a third one. How do you get to that aspect of understanding what would come first versus second versus third as you're thinking through that and thinking about what would be a good place to start someone on a clinical trial? So
currently what we know who is a non-responder. So based on the current guidelines, you have to be on ursodiol for at least a year. And then your alkaline phosphatase, which is one of your liver enzymes, should be above certain threshold. And the threshold is 1.67, which basically is close between the 180s to 190s based on whatever lab you use. So decide if after a year your alkaline phosphatase does not go below that number, that threshold, this is when you start thinking, okay, maybe the patient should go to a second-line therapy or a research therapy. Okay. And again, this is exactly when we start looking or combining different receptors. Does the patient was exposed to an FXR? Does the patient have side effects on FXR? For example, FXR agonists have more pruritus. Pruritus is itching as a side effect. So if a patient with PBC comes in with severe itching, I don't want to give a medication that can make it worse. So maybe I should go to a different receptor or a different side effect profile. So all those things kind of matter. And all those things basically, once the patient comes in to see us for the first time, we will kind of like just see and what is the best fit for that patient.
Great. And as far as you touched on a point there that, the idea of side effects, or also known as adverse events. And, I guess, how do you talk to your patients about, what to consider for a new drug that may be in trial? What to consider, what do they need to know about it? And what do they need to know as far as potential adverse events, of any that are known?
So kind of like, this is also very important to know. So when someone enters a clinical trial, so if I give a medication, for example, ursodiol, I usually disclose to patients, it's like, this is your dose, this is the most common side effects, constipation, headache, etc. But unfortunately, because it's an FDA medication, we really don't need to basically report exactly everything that the patient tells us that is going wrong with that medication. When you are in a clinical trial, we are doing the same thing. We're disclosing, a patient, you're taking drug A has A, B, and C as a side effect. But if any extra side effects comes up, we have to report them in what's called adverse events. So we have to make sure that the patient comes in to see us. There's actually a specific login for side effects or adverse events in patients who are in a clinical trial. And basically, we need to make sure that they're really not related to the medications and there's no drug-drug interaction with the medication. So I would say it's the same principle, meaning we still have to disclose. We have to make sure that we tell our patients what are their side effects, what are the risks, what are the benefits of taking a new medication. But unfortunately, the reporting and the way it's monitored is a little bit different.
Sure. No, that totally makes sense. And as far as looking at the aspect of, different types of trials, I know there's also the aspect of more registry trials or information that would be to, for the NIH or someone, a government body, to understand PBC or another rare condition better. Can you give us a little bit about that and the purpose of those type of trials?
So also really good, important things is, of course, pharma sponsors, Medicaid, the clinical trials are really important because they have the medications and we need patients to be enrolled so they can take the medications, prove that they actually work. But also, for example, people like me really need patients to basically proof of concept. We need to know what happens with the immune system. Well, we need to know what happens with the data, even if they don't take a medication, or what happens if they take medication, for example, in their blood cells or in their liver tissue. So there are called registries, and then I think most of us will have registries. And what we do with registries is we actually gather with a lot of people around the world and we share all the information. And we're able to basically look at trends. For example, what happens when people are taking medication, your alkaline phosphatase doesn't come down, and that increases mortality, that increases morbidity. So I think both types of clinical trials, one, a clinical trial is designated to actually get the medication, but the other part of it is actually to understand the disease, to know what happens with the disease. For example, we have quality of life questionnaires, we have bone density related issues to PBC, we have, for example, depression associated to PBC, fatigue associated to PBC. We really want to know everything about the condition, and then the way to do that is actually to get registries. We get tissue, we're able to understand, for example, there's new data about looking specifically, it's called personalized medicine. So we looked at bile acid, and based on your bile acid response to certain medications, we can even trim or look at if you're going to respond to certain medications. So all of those things could not be possible. We don't have the other parts of the clinical trials.
Awesome. No, that's good to know. And I think that's definitely an interesting side of it, because we always think about more of the pharmaceutical side, but I think that information, and as they say, knowledge is power. So it's a interesting side of things. Now, as far as, talking to your patients, as far as, the process of enrolling into a clinical trial and kind of how you're going to work with them on this, can you give a little bit of overview as far as, how you would work with a new patient, both yourself or other team members, at Beth Israel?
So this is also very important to understand. People are very nervous about enrolling in a clinical trial, and they really, it's like, are you calling me a guinea pig? They're like, we'll use all this type of words. And basically, enrolling in a clinical trial I usually tell patients that it's like you're going to have more eyes and you're going to have like VIP treatment for the next couple of months.
Mhm.
What does that mean? So basically what I tell my patients, let's say you're a patient who has failed conventional therapy and really, you don't want to use this therapy, but I have this, I show them, this is all the clinical trials that you'll be able to kind of roll in. This is the kind of the time frame. This is the medications. This is the duration of the therapy. This is a possible side effect. This is a possible intervention. And this is kind of the time frame that we're looking for. Of course, clinical trials are very kind of time consuming. What does this mean? So patients will have to come in a certain amount of time because we have certain dates to cover. So for example, if you're in a clinic, I can see you every 6 months. If that 6 months doesn't, it comes 7 or 8 months. There's no really difference. In the clinical trial, we have to be very strict about timelines because that's very important for the actual clinical trial. So that's one thing that we talk with patients. If you're a patient who work doesn't give you enough free time or doesn't give you time to really come to referral centers, maybe a clinical trial is not the right thing for you. The other thing that I talk to people about clinical trials is you might also be getting placebo. What does this mean? Is like you might not be getting the medication, and either the patient or me will know until the end of the trial. So that's kind of a risk that we need to take as physician-patient relationship and tell them, listen, you are contributing to science, and eventually what we'll see if your trial shows improvement or success, eventually you will be able to take the medication, but that will be along the road. So all those things need to be in consideration. And of course, there has to be a consent. They meet usually what happens, they go downstairs and meet the research team. There is a different phlebotomist. There's a different person who will see them and they will call them. So there will be a different type of team that will follow them through the clinical trial on top of me, who is the physician taking care of that person.
Okay. And what about the aspect of obviously a lot of things, even this meeting or other meetings have changed due to COVID, and kind of those interactions are less frequent as you visit your doctor, more virtual, those kind of things. How much have you seen that change over the past 2 years as far as, your interactions with the patients that are enrolled in your trials?
So I think, fortunately, PBC patients really are, I would say, they know their disease, and they really will come to us asking me, hey, listen, I learned online about this new clinical trial. So we are getting a little more freedom of actually doing online visits for people with clinical trials, which is also being a little bit, it's actually becoming a little more flexible. You can get your labs or your blood test close to home. We will get them, and then we can basically do a visit, and that will count as your visit. So I think we've learned in the COVID times that we can use the technology to help us to actually improve care. And this is one of the aspects. Are we still getting in there because we need a little bit more consent, and we need a little more kind of like freedom from my IRBs, from my, to make sure that they're allowed doing this. But I think it's coming, and it actually is getting into our clinical trials. And it's something that we are taking advantage.
And one thing, as you were talking through that aspect of kind of enrolling patients and helping educate them on, the treatment and or placebo, can you just do a brief kind of overview of the idea of like a blinded, a double blind, an open label, crazy label, whatever it may be, because there's a lot of different aspects to the labels of a trial.
And this is one of the key things that when I talk to a patient about a clinical trial. So I think something you mentioned is, let's say a patient is enrolled in a double-blind placebo trial. So what does that mean is a patient will be enrolled to an arm or a part with a study where the patient will get the medication A, and also the patient will get placebo. Placebo, we'll call it a sugar pill if you want to call it that way. Neither the patient, which is double-blinded, is neither the patient or the physician will know what the patient is getting, because that way you prevent what's called bias, meaning we won't know. And if I don't have the blood test, I won't know what the patient is getting, because if I see the blood test improving, I can tell you're most likely getting the medication. So no, we as physicians, we won't know any of those details, because that's part of a clinical trial. We want to make sure that no one is biased, and everyone who's on a clinical trial by the end of the trial knows that the medication is working. So that's a double-blind placebo-controlled trial. Again, an open label, most of the open label studies, let's say a phase 3 study, most of the PBC studies going phase 3 are double-blind randomized trial. Once we know it works, let's say it went 48 weeks, 52 weeks with the medication, and we know the medication works, most of the patients who got placebo, they got onto the open label part. What does that mean? They will get, all of them will get the medication for a certain amount of time. So even the placebo group, all the people who got the medication will continue taking the medication as part of the clinical trial, which is called open label. So I will know that the patient is taking it, and the pharmaceutical will know that everyone is taking the medication because the study showed that this medication worked to improve the PBC or the disease.
Great. Now you mentioned, as you mentioned earlier too, you mentioned there's a variety and length of times for a clinical trial. For the ones that are more of the medication and kind of that phase 3, how typically long is that going to take, and kind of getting into that aspect of, potentially crossing arms and all that?
So most of those, I would say, again, average, this depends on each clinical trial time, but most of them between 48, 52 weeks, that's close to a year of therapy. Again, for example, when we start doing the phase 2 for PBCs, we're only 12 weeks because remember, we're trying to prove a concept that they work, and after 12 weeks, they stop. But once they know those phase 2 trials work, they go into phase 3, which is kind of like a year. And after a year, we go into open label trials, which basically 2 or 3 years of taking the medication. And by then we expect that the FDA will get the announcement and hopefully the FDA will approve them. So this is a time frame from a phase 2 to an open label. That's the time frame of close to 4 to 5 years. That's the time that we would expect to go to the FDA and get them approved.
Great. Now, one of the things too I wanted to check on, I know both the PBCers.org and the Canadian PBC Society that we have on the line tonight have, a listing of the clinical trials and or direct access to clinicaltrials.gov. Now, if someone was, trying to find out if a trial would be right for them, how do they go through that aspect of kind of looking at not only the condition of primary biliary cholangitis, but also looking into the inclusion or exclusion criteria? Like, how do I know if I'm in or I'm out just from looking at that?
So I would say this is it's a very difficult aspect for a patient because if you log into clinicaltrials.gov, you will see every single primary investigator in the country. Whether if you actually hit primary biliary cholangitis, it will actually list you close to 200 sites with different clinical trials.
Yep.
What I would suggest is if you're Massachusetts, for example, in Boston, and you say hit PBC, and there's 2 centers, I would say go and call them. And the exclusion criteria are so strict and so difficult for a patient to understand that it's better to go to the physician, better present yourself as a new patient to those 2 centers, and look if you can qualify for a study for PBC. And that's my best suggestion at this moment. Great.
Yeah, that's rather than trying to figure out yourself, that's a nice way to kind of work with your partner, with your physician partner. And I guess, if a physician doesn't necessarily bring that up and you call, is there a way to, discuss with your doctor, wondering if a clinical trial might be right for you?
I mean, I'm looking at for the other side, so I'm biased in that answer. So I would say a clinical trial is always good for you because, again, you're giving more information to science. But I think approaching your local gastroenterologist or local primary care is very important because if you feel that you don't respond to therapy, and again, currently we only have 2 approved therapies. So ursodiol is the first one, and obeticholic acid. And most 2 general gastroenterologists don't feel comfortable using those medications. So by then, you will be referred to what's called tertiary or some referral centers. So I would say it's always good to ask if there's any clinical trials because there's always other options. Even if you want to join, if you don't want to be part of them, understanding the disease also involved to understand what's in research. So even as a patient, to get to know what's out there, what's new, it's really important for the future of the care of your own disease.
Great. And one question we had from the audience was focusing on the natural history of someone. How does that natural history of a patient play into suggesting a clinical trial?
Really interesting question. So what we know with PBC, so there are certain kind of like markers that we know. Let's say a patient comes in and has a very low alkaline phosphatase and a very low FibroScan. I can just by those two really numbers at the first encounter, I can say if the patient is going to have a really good prognosis. So if a FibroScan is low, let's say 3 to 4, and the alkaline phosphatase is really low, close to normal, that patient really should not be looking for a clinical trial. That patient's outcomes are going to be great. So what are the patients that we worried? We worried those FibroScans were high, or patients who already presented with complications of cirrhosis, or patients with an alkaline phosphatase are really high, who's not coming down with therapy. So this is a type of patient that I'm just worried. This is the type of patients I'm really kind of try to get into clinical trials, because those are the patients that we need.
Yeah, interesting. And I guess one of the other questions, kind of a twist on another question, comorbidities are pretty common overall, right? With PBC, could have diabetes, could have other conditions, Sjögren's, what have you. But also, as you look at dual comorbidities in the liver arena, say PBC and NASH, as you look at, working with your patients, how do you kind of weed through that, or do you focus on one at a time? How do you kind of, play through that?
So I think this is also excellent point that you're just really now just bringing up. So we are also, although COVID is one of the pandemics, I would say obesity and metabolic syndrome is one of the biggest that we're facing right now. So we are facing, on top of PBC, patients are overweight, they have diabetes, so they do have all the risk factors for having fatty liver disease. So we treat both at the same time, but sometimes it's really hard just based on their liver test, on their presentation, to say, okay, I'm just only dealing with one aspect, no, I'm not dealing with the other one, or we're dealing with both. So sometimes we really need a little more information. More information means, for example, tissue, which is a liver biopsy, and that involves, of course, like a invasive procedure that patients really are afraid for. So when you go to the clinical trials aspect, that's also very important, because if you do have other conditions or other comorbidities, that rules them out. That's part of the exclusion criteria. So if you have a fatty liver plus PBC and the biopsy looks like there's both, unfortunately, we won't be able to include those patients in clinical trials. For example, as you mentioned, patients with PBC has other autoimmune conditions, and there's a entity called overlap. They have PBC, but they have autoimmune hepatitis, or PBC or primary sclerosing cholangitis. If you have any of those conditions, you won't be able to include in the clinical trials, because that's part of the exclusion criteria. So yes, we will have to learn in detail what's going on with that patient. But again, any signs of 2 diseases, 3 diseases, unfortunately, that will exclude him completely from a clinical trial.
Interesting. Great. No, I appreciate that. And I guess even looking at autoimmune liver disease in general, you would do quite a bit of work in there as well. One of the things I wanted to check on as well, I know you work a lot with the Hispanic community and have done a lot to kind of disrupt some of the disparities. As people are trying to talk with their doctor and maybe are Hispanic or Black or other disparaged kind of community, is there an aspect where you can help them, or you would empower them to talk to their physicians and make sure that they're being represented?
Again, this is one of those, I would say, hot topics that are out there. So yes, the answer to that question is yes. So what we know in the literature is, we did a study, looked at, for example, disparities in autoimmune liver disease, but we include everything that's autoimmune liver disease. And we did find no difference in outcomes, right? So if you are white, you're Hispanic, or you're Black, there's no difference in outcomes at the end. That doesn't mean there's disparities. Of course, we know that Blacks have less access to care, Hispanics have less access to care, because again, their cultural basis, their health is just basically taken care in a different way. For autoimmune conditions, we really know that, for example, autoimmune conditions are more prevalent in the Black communities. So again, you're right, but we need to teach everyone the same, but we need to try to bring and educate from a disparity perspective everyone with a lot of what's going on with the autoimmune world. And again, for example, clinical trials is one part of it. And then the other part is registry. So we have in our registry, and we looked at your ethnicity, your race, as a part of those outcomes. And that's something that we need to understand so we can have more information for the future.
Great. No, I appreciate that. And I guess as you look to that aspect of supporting patients that are enrolling in trials, and you mentioned quite a bit of support from your office, what about support from family or friends, as you're going through this, and obviously a lot of extra work that you have to do to go through a clinical trial. Any thoughts on how you talk with friends or family about what you're going to be going through and how you explain it to them if they don't come to the appointment with you?
That's actually very important. I think, part of, right now we are getting over one of those COVID surges. And unfortunately for patients, that's one of the big things that actually was a big problem. Patients were only able to come alone to clinic visits. And I think that's a problem because sometimes you're so nervous, sometimes you're so biased, you really are looking for, you're coming into a new world and you really don't have the time or I would say the mind to focus. And that second pair of ears or eyes are very, very important. So I would encourage now that we're getting this surge to get more people involved, but also there are like this groups. I mean, there's Facebook groups, there's Twitter groups, there's support groups. So the more information you know from your disease, the better you're going to be able to take care of it. So we as a physicians, we'll have handouts about what's the disease. For example, in our first encounter, we do spend a lot of time explaining the natural history of the condition, what is going to happen, what is the, what are the, yes, I respond, what is plan A, what plan B, and plan C, but it's also very important to get the family involved and get all the support system because, it's a journey that all of us will get together.
Nice. No, that's great to hear. And as far as even, I know obviously it was a bit more prevalent before, but does your facility kind of facilitate even live meetings or virtual live meetings with patients in your group? Or how do you kind of help, other than connecting with PBCers and with Canadian PBC Society and other groups like that, how do you kind of help your patients get to know others and what they're going through and what could happen to them?
I think we could be better than that, Tom. I would say we don't do enough in that perspective. Again, Carol, who usually send me all those pamphlets about the PBCers, I usually tell them that, about all the foundations, all the online support that there's there. And I think that's the most that we can do right now, but we don't have kind of support groups for PBC in our hospital that will tell you, okay, there's a PBC group, please join and talk about your issues. So that would be great to have, but unfortunately with all the kind of HIPAA violations and all those things are really difficult to do. So I would encourage my patients to continue to use the support groups, which are great. And this is our really good platforms to ask questions and to get to know us all over the country to see, what physicians you can go and ask about everything that's out there from the disease.
Great. Now, as far as, one of the big passions I have, I guess, is technology and kind of looking into, simple solution apps, other things to kind of help us, ease our life and keep track of things, those types of things. Have you seen any cool technology that you can talk about kind of in the works to, help understand what's going on with the clinical trial or help the patient kind of monitor their own health, those kind of things?
So I think apps about clinical trials, I don't think we have one. Again, I think the best website that I have, clinicaltrials.gov, it's very easy. You basically put the state, put the disease, and you get a million options of who are the primary investigators and all the clinical trials they have available. Unfortunately, there's not really a lot of information there. I think from the other side, I've seen a lot of really cool apps. I've seen a lot of cool things to do from a PBC perspective. For example, I've seen an app where you can put your phos, you can trend it over time. I've seen an app where you looked at the guidelines, which are translated to kind of a patient language so they can understand what's going on. And I've seen apps where they looked at, for example, depression and fatigue, different questionnaires. So they really talk to their physician. Once the patients take those questionnaires, they can go to the physician and say, listen, I got my, for example, the age questionnaire, where I got my PBC 40 questionnaire, which is basically a quality of life questionnaire. And based on that, you actually are more empowered to go to your physicians to actually do something about your condition. So there is a lot of good technology out there, and I think we should be taking advantage of that.
Cool. Yeah, good to hear. I'm always a fan of that. And one of the things you mentioned a point that I did want to touch on as well. Now, as we look at kind of guidelines and what the recommendations are from the governing bodies, AASLD and ACG, other guiding bodies, kind of in gastroenterology, hepatology, liver disease, what's the process as far as getting some of these either registry trials information or the clinical trials and on medications, et cetera. What's the process as far as getting that kind of incorporated and maybe modifying or learning or changing the way we do guidelines recommendations?
So guidelines usually are kind of like, let's just think about kind of the holy grail, right? Those are the people, experts get together, they looked at all the information, all the data that's available. They really put a document saying, based on everything that's out there, that's what we think we should do in patients who come with PBC. If you look at, for example, specifically going to ASLD, which is the American Society of Liver Disease guidelines, if you look at the PBC guidelines, the kind of the most recent one is 2019, and before that was 2008. So this is how different the disease had changed. So I would say from a patient perspective, guidelines have a lot of medical terms and they're not very easy to read for patients. But again, what I'm saying, Tom, is like there's new apps that will translate this kind of really heavy medical language and will incorporate it in the patient language. And then you try to, as a patient, try to understand. But again, let's just don't focus on guidelines. Let's just focus on what's good for your patient. What is what we're doing as patient groups. How can we be empowered? How do we get all that information so we can ask questions and communicate to our physicians what are the right questions at that time?
Great. No, that's a good point. I appreciate that. And as far as, getting into the aspects of, we talked about the care, the extra support that comes from your team, the extra support that would come from the company that's sponsoring the trial, those types of things. So as you go through a trial, what kind of expectations might someone entering a trial expect from their insurance company or any kind of out-of-pocket or those kind of things to expect?
So that's also very important. That's something that I forgot to tell you. So we tell patients that everything that will go through a clinical trial will be covered by the clinical trial. So that includes from imaging, biopsies, medication, sometimes even transportation, parking, you name it, even just lodging, all those things will be covered by the clinical trial. Your insurance, we're very kind of involved about medical insurance. Medical insurance will not be involved at any of the kind of charts that actually got patients who are enrolled in clinical trials. So you should not be afraid of your insurance knowing that you're into a clinical trial. So there is no really, that's actually information that will be really, really preserved, and insurance will not have access.
Okay. And what about the aspect, you just mentioned an interesting subject, if I wanted to come to Boston this weekend and enjoy the snow with you, would it cover that type of a trip? Or, covering transportation, is that something where you're reimbursed or they provide a shuttle service? Is there kind of, how far away can I be from Boston to participate in your center's trial?
That's a good question. Again, there is no clear set of guideline exactly what means, transportation. Let's say, Tom, you are enrolled in my clinical trial, you live in New York, and you're being part of my clinical trial because this is like a both ways, right? You are coming to help me, I'm going to try to help you. So for example, the night before you need an hotel to stay, you come in the night before, you come in first thing in the morning, and by the end of the morning, you should be kind of on your way out. So we will cover that night before going in to facilitate things, because again, as a clinical trial, it's very time consuming. We will run a lot of blood tests. So you'll be spending more time than you will spend on a regular clinic visit. So, we know that your time is also money. So in a way, we will try to make sure that we pay you in whatever ways we can. Meaning if you need to be here the night before, or you need to pay your parking, or you need to basically spend time having dinner here, we'll try to accommodate those things so you can actually at least be part of the clinical trial without any major issues.
Okay. Interesting. Great. Now, I know we talked about kind of clinicaltrials.gov, those ideas of registries. What about the idea of kind of search tools? I know we on the PBCers, we have the Antidote Clinical Trial Search Tool. Is that something that you often send your patients to?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is part of the kind of supports, kind of the support groups that we use. So the answer to that question is yes. So again, any media, any platform, any way to tell patients that we are out there as part of a group that we are doing clinical trials, we use it. So yes, everything is welcome.
Great. And one other question I see here as well, if you are in a clinical trial and you by chance were on the placebo, do you ever find that out?
You do. So once the clinical TLD, so at the end of the clinical trial, we'll take some time. And again, remember that, you're in a center with a clinical trial. That doesn't mean once you finish, you're the only one that finished. So there's different timelines and different physicians and patients have different timelines at different times. So once the sponsor is a pharmaceutical, says, okay, we are done with the 3 years. Everyone has finished 3 years. We basically just unblind, meaning we break up the blindness, say, okay, patient A got drug A, patient B was a placebo, patient C was a placebo, patient D was a medication. And we can tell the patients, yes, you were doing that.
Oh, cool.
Which brings also a good thing. Let's say a patient is having a severe adverse event during the clinical trial. We can basically ask the sponsor, which is a pharmaceutical, to break break the blindness to make sure the patient is receiving the medication, because we really want to know, because the patient can end up in the hospital with serious side effect and all this stuff. So this is kind of specific things that we can do in a clinical trial that we need to ask the sponsor to do.
Awesome. No, that's good. Yeah, it's important to know, because if that would happen, obviously that'd be pretty scary. In the last few minutes we have left, are there any key areas that I may have not touched on that you feel are important to add and discuss with the team here?
I think we've covered most of the things. And again, I know, again, I want to emphasize how nerve-wracking seems to say, okay, I'm going to be part of the clinical trial, because it's sometimes unknown. I can tell you, you'll be monitored very closely. The other good things about PBC, most of the medications for PBC that are currently in clinical trials, their side effects are very benign, very minimal. And usually the things and the data that we're gaining and all the stuff that we're gaining out of those new medications, it's incredible. Again, we're hopeful that by 2025, 2026, we'll have those medications out there in the market. But think about it, going from one medication to almost going to 10 medications, it's a huge difference. So we will have different options for patients in the future. And also, we're in a country that also insurance drives our medications that we can use, unfortunately. So the more options that we have, I don't know what insurance Tom has in New York or Alan has in Boston, and different insurance approve different medications, but we have a lot of them, then we have no problems treating PBC. And finally, access. I think at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is getting more access for patients so we can prevent complications of the PBC. Because although it sounds like their medications are very expensive, I can tell you that a transplant and the complications of a PBC are more expensive than actually the clinical trials and the medications.
Great. Awesome. No, thanks for that wrap up. Closing, just wanted to thank you, Dr. Bonder, for all of your help and discussion today. It's been a pleasure to understand a little bit more about the clinical trial research strategy and, the helping patients, caregivers, loved ones understand how to go through the process of potentially looking at a clinical trial, going through the process, enrolling, and all of the extra help that you mentioned. As part of the PBCers organization, I wanted to thank you for that participation. And we also want to thank Susan Sardis from the Community Liver Alliance as well for sponsoring us and providing this Zoom link for us to host this live event. And lastly, just wanted to keep everybody in touch, and we do have more planned events, both live discussions, as well as looking to our PBCers conference in 2022. We are scheduling it for a live conference in person, October 13th through 15th in Raleigh, North Carolina. So hopefully we'll see a lot of the people that were on the phone today at that meeting, as well as yourself, Dr. Bonder.
All right. Again, thank you so much for the invitation. And again, please, reach out to me with questions. And I'm here at Beth Israel in Boston.